Okay, so Ron, what we have is a three-dimensional grid made up of these filaments. And these filaments are of a very small diameter and comprise of positive and negative primaries, all interacting and annihilating one another, but not enough to stop a gradual creation of energy. This would explain the ever-increasing expansion of the universe that has been witnessed, and seem to do away with the need for the Big Bang and the ridiculous cosmological constant. You say that this grid generates a flow of quantum waves, and that it's this interaction of these waves that cause particles of matter to seem to be produced. Once we have sufficient numbers of these particles, they can then, I guess, go on to behave more conventionally to produce the matter seen in the universe today.
That's right.
You mentioned these pressure gradients that surround matter, and the fact that there's a net positive energy within matter and a balancing of negative energies away from that.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yes. I haven't in fact covered enough detail. For this whole system to operate, there has to be an asymmetry in the way the energy is distributed between the primary particles. Each primary particle has its energy split two ways: mass energy and kinetic energy. The mass energy is the energy the particle is made of when it's standing still. And to accelerate that particle to make it move at a high speed, extra energy has to be added to it. This is kinetic energy. And the sum total of those is its total energy. Now, in any pair collision, it's the total energy that remains the same. When a pair of primaries collide, they breed by increasing the energy of both particles, and both have to gain energy of exactly the same amount as the gain for its partner, except it's of opposite sign. But here we're talking about a total energy gain. Now it turns out that the positive primary has to have more of its total energy in the form of mass energy and less of it as kinetic energy than in its partner. And what happens then is that the overall medium will have a greater amount of mass energy, but the kinetic energy of the negative partners is the greater, and this causes the pressure, the net pressure of the ether, to be negative. So we have a mixture in which the rest energy is positive, but the kinetic energy is negative, producing a negative pressure. And that negative pressure, in combination with the deradiants, which are produced around a massive object, produce a buoyancy force on the particles of matter. And it is this buoyancy force, which is in fact a negative buoyancy force because they push it downwards instead of upwards, which is responsible for the gravitational force. The other forces of nature, there are four forces altogether. The three remaining forces are electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, which is responsible for radioactive decay, and you have the strong force, which is this force which causes atomic nuclei to survive. The strong force is necessary to hold the particles together against the repulsion caused by the electromagnetic force. What the new picture seems to suggest is that the only real force is that of gravity, and that the remaining forces are contrived. The gravitational force appears automatically as a result of matter building, according to this model. But one doesn't actually need a real electromagnetic force. Let's just consider the electrostatic force, which is a major component of electromagnetism. The electrostatic force, if you have two positively charged components, and we're talking about positive charge now, which has nothing whatever to do with positive energy. You can have electric charge can appear in two kinds, positive and negative. Two negative charges close together repel each other, as do two positive charges. It's only when you get a positive charge and a negative charge you get attraction. But what this new model suggests is that these forces are not real ones, they are abstract. Because if you have real electric forces, then you have a belt and braces situation in the construction of an atom. For example, let's think about the hydrogen atom, which is the simplest possible. This consists of a proton carrying a positive electric charge at the centre of the atom, and you have an electron, which in the first models produced by Rutherford and Bohr were orbiting the nucleus in a very similar way to a planet going round the sun. But this model was then superseded by Schrodinger's atom, in which the electron is best imagined as jumping about all over the place, controlled only by some abstract waves, a wave pattern, the Schrodinger's waves, which are an interference pattern of waves like dropping pebbles on a pond and watching the ripples go out and interfering with each other. This interference pattern determines where a particle is to be at any instant. If the electrons are produced by these interference patterns, so they appear all over the place, but within a spherical object, within a spherical orbital, defining the orbit of the atom, they don't need to be held in by a real electric force. They're already being positioned by the waves, so you don't need both kinds. It would work just as well if the particle is just labelled positive at the centre and labelled negative for the electron, and no electric force really exists, but we would interpret it as a real force because it would appear that way to us, but it doesn't need to be real. And if the electric force doesn't need to be real, then we don't really need to have a strong nuclear force either as a reality, because in this case there's nothing really pushing the charged particles apart. For example, the next atom to be considered is the deuteron, the heavy hydrogen atom, which consists of two protons stuck together by the strong force. The proton, each proton has a positive electric charge, and so they force themselves apart. So it's inferred that a strong nuclear force needs to be there as well to stop them from flying apart. In our new picture, there's no real force trying to push them apart, so no real strong force is required either. In fact, what would be needed is a slight, a very much smaller repulsive force to stop them collapsing together by the gravitational force. So only the gravitational force really needs to be a real force produced by this negative buoyancy action. The remainder are then simply contrived by the way the atoms are organised by the waves.
Doesn't the current theory have invent a form of negative coupling?
Oh yes, that's another point. In the conventional theory, in conventional theory, forces of repulsion are modelled by what are called mediators. The mediating particle is emitted from one subatomic particle and is absorbed by another, and the effect is often likened to two skaters on ice throwing a heavy ball back and forth between them. They would push each other apart as they each threw and caught the ball. But there's no similar way in which force of attraction can be modelled. So what they do is to introduce an idea called the negative coupling, which is simply a negative sign added to the equation, which makes the equations model attraction. But it's not satisfactory, because in this case a major law of physics called the conservation of momentum is violated in a major way. With the new approach, one needs no real forces of attraction except the gravitational one, which has already been described.
Great, Rob. That explains that quite nicely. I wonder if I could just go back to, you mentioned a form of buoyancy when you're talking about gravity. Can you explain a little bit more about that and your concept as space as being a form of compressible liquid or vapour?
Yes. The compressibility of this ether is really not the same as a compression we would think of, say, compressing air, where you take a chunk of air and squeeze it to a smaller volume. In this case, we've got a system of pure creation and pure annihilation going on continuously, and the waves that are initially used to produce subatomic particles eventually travel out to infinite distance, and as they go they stimulate more creation, and so we get a density gradient produced by this excess creation which is going on. And it has the beauty of, in fact, producing a model for gravity which fits all the experimental checks just as well as special and general relativity, but has the huge advantage of being totally free from the internal contradictions which confound relativity, and also eliminate the mismatch of relativity with quantum theory.
So effectively, where we have matter, outside of that we have large negative energy halos which with distance diminish in the density, and within this space it's expanding because of the breathing, and that kind of explains the latest observations on supernova.
Oh yes it does. Well, going back to the beginning again, we started off with an initial inflation caused by pure creation as primary pairs collided, but this was very soon overtaken by the onset of annihilation, which cancelled out nearly all the creation going on, but not quite. The mathematics then shows that following this inflation period would be a state of not just expansion, but ever accelerating expansion. In fact, it turns out that the acceleration is proportional to distance, and also the velocity of recession of one particle from another is proportional to distance. And these two things are now accepted. Initially, Hubble showed by our astronomical observations that distant objects were receding from us at a speed proportional to their distance from us. That's called the Hubble constant. And now, in 1998, observations of distant supernovae suggest that the expansion of the universe is speeding up instead of slowing down, as cosmologists had assumed. But this comes out of the theory as a prediction. In fact, it came out as a prediction as early as 1993.
How does this fit in with the current conventional thoughts that the universe is only about 12 billion years old, and some observations of stars being older than that don't fit in? Where does it put the age of the universe?
Very much older than the 12 billion years which the cosmologists allow. In fact, I've traced it back to 100 billion years, and the size of the universe is half what it is today, which is makes it almost indefinitely old. Matter would only arise long after the ether had been created, because matter in this situation can only appear until the ether has generated a conscious intelligence able to produce matter as a deliberate creative act. And I think that the recent observation of gamma ray bursts is representing new creations going on all the time.
So effectively, if the universe is 100 billion years old, then that would easily allow for stars to be created seemingly 14, 15 billion years ago.
Oh yes, much longer ago.
Yeah.
I think that there was no single creation of matter, as in the Big Bang theory, but that it's going on all the time. And the gamma ray bursts, which are enormously energetic, it may well be little bangs going on all the time, producing new galaxies to fill in the gaps which are ever increasing. As the ether itself expands, gaps are appearing, and it can fill these gaps in by producing new galaxies.
Okay, so we've got this space, which is like a compressible liquid. It has a buoyancy effect, and there's negative density gradients around it. Einstein always maintained that gravity wasn't a force. So how does your theory work with that?
This is a big bone of contention. I think Einstein was totally wrong. In fact, we've completely reversed the situation, because in current theory, Einstein's theory of gravity says there's no force of gravity. Instead, things fall by moving in straight lines in curved space-time with no force actually being involved. And all the other forces, like electromagnetism and the strong nuclear force, they are real forces. Now what appears is a total change. Only gravity is the real, and the other forces are abstract. This is very important, because all sorts of inconsistencies are appearing. For example, quantum theorists are trying to model gravity by using a thing called a graviton. These gravitons are emitted from one particle and are absorbed by another one, which means they're using absorption models for gravitons. And all measurements made to try and measure absorption of gravity have failed. For example, tests have been made during eclipses of the sun by the moon. The moon interposed between the sun means that if you'd have some gravitons from the sun absorbed by the moon, and so you'd have a gravitational shadow produced wherever the light shadow occurs. But although attempts have been made to measure these gravitational shadows, absolutely no value has been obtained for this. So absorption cannot be the correct model. Furthermore, the absorption models which are being used assume a force of gravity exists, and they're trying to produce a theory of gravity which uses Einstein's model. An Einstein model says there isn't a gravitational force, so how can they possibly expect to tie in Einstein's theory of gravity, which has no force, by models which involve a force? The whole thing doesn't fit.
Okay, so in this theory we have the effects, well, the only real thing is gravity.
Yes.
How do we fit into all this? How do our minds and matter systems fit into this theory? As we are made up of matter ourselves, I presume we are then a form of illusion or a construct of the grid as well.
On this basis, matter does appear very much like a virtual reality rather than something truly real. But it's a virtual reality written in 3 dimensions on a 3-dimensional screen. The ether itself produces a 3-dimensional screen, and our bodies are part of the picture, so they are organised to appear as the only reality. We can't connect with anything else except the matter system to which we are attuned. Now, on this basis, we have to try and decide what the mind really is. The established theorists say mind is pure brain function. The brain itself is a mass of neurons interconnected by their axons and synaptic junctions. And according to some people, such as Penrose and Hameroff, there are microtubules inside the neurons and the axons, which are also part of the picture. But this is a matter system generating a mind. Now, this may well be true. There may be a brain mind. But all the evidence we have suggests that there's also a background mind, either in addition or instead of. It's difficult to suggest which of these cases is true. My own belief is that there is no brain mind, that the only mind really existing is the one part of the background. We have already said that for matter to be produced, a background mind had to exist. It had to generate, first of all, an intelligent consciousness, and then deliberately create matter. It therefore seems very probable that our individual mind would simply be built by causing off a section of the background mind by using a filter barrier for information, so as to shut it out from the rest of the universe, and then couple this with the brain, which operates the matter system of the human body, and this brain then acts simply as an interface between the background mind and the body. This would seem to me the most obvious thing. And then the overall result would be that the mind, part of the background, would only be able to see through the sense organs of touch, taste and smell and sight. These sense organs would sense the virtual reality and transmit it as information to the brain, which is then processed and passed on to the background mind. And the background mind cannot get information in any other way because of this filter barrier for information. And so the mind is deliberately made to think of the matter system as true reality and all that exists.
So effectively, we're matter systems constructed by the grid. We can move freely through this grid, and we're linked to it with our minds. However, there has to be a filter barrier in our minds to stop us getting overloaded from all the information from the ether. So what seems real to us is actually all just one illusion, and the only real reality is this grid and the waves of gravitation. Are there any experiments that can back up, or that you've mentioned that could be done to prove this theory of yours?
In fact, there are 9 experiments which are thrown up by the new theory, all of which would also act as new checks on relativity. All physicists say that there aren't enough checks for relativity, and this would more than double the total number. Unfortunately, as far as relativists are concerned, these should, according to my own work, be experiments on which relativity would fail.
Are there any experiments that have been done recently that might confirm or...
One experiment has already been done by Brillet and Hall, which produced an anomaly. They used 2 lasers, one on a rotating table and one fixed. And in fact this was really a very sophisticated interferometer for measuring the absolute speed of the Earth, that is the speed of the Earth relative to any ether. But what they were really trying to do was to get a null result, which would confirm relativity. What actually happened was that they got what they call a persistent anomaly, which was then interpreted by Aston, Dr. Harold Aston, as an accurate measurement of the surface speed of the Earth. It came out within about 5%, which is very good for this kind of experiment. This, together with other experiments, and now I'm talking about the Shapiro time delay, there's an anomaly here again. The initial theory given by Einstein is far less time delay than the measurements. And in studying this, I found that I could fill in the gap if I assumed that the ether, which I now call the ether, was in a state of a fluid, in a state of vortex motion about the sun, and with the Earth moving along with the fluid. This then satisfied the experimental checks on the Shapiro time delay, and it also enabled this experiment of Bray and Hall to be given a concrete model. It also fitted in with another experiment by Michelson and Gale, done in 1925, which showed that it's called the Earth rotation experiment. It showed that the Earth is in angular motion relative to a background fluid. These experiments all fit in very nicely and suggest that in fact the Earth is moving along with the background fluid as that moves in vortex motion centered on the sun. Every single star in our galaxy would be similarly fixed as a center for a vortex, and these will be embedded in a larger vortex centered on the galaxy.
So we've got some experiments which have been done recently which actually do go to show that there is an existence of this ether, and a lot of what you've said today, we've also got several other experiments which can be done to prove your theory. But the other thing is, I think you've very nicely explained that many of the inconsistencies in conventional theory don't exist with this theory.
That's right.
So in all, you've come up with something which offers far greater step forward for physics today.
I hope so. The point is that for over 60 years, theorists have been trying to match up Einstein's relativity theories with quantum theory, and they all admit to total failure. The latest theories are string theories, which are attempted to do this, and again, they failed. There's no way they can resolve this dilemma. In my view, it's Einstein's relativity theory which is completely falsely based, and it was never possible to integrate that with quantum theory. You have to completely start again with a theory of gravity, which is what I've done, and then you can find a solution to this problem.
Ron, I understand with this new theory that in actual fact there is a possibility that it might be able to explain how we could end up getting free energy applications and over unity devices. Can you perhaps explain a little bit how that might work?
Yes. Quite a number of people have in fact claimed free energy devices, but they all say that this energy is extracted from what they call zero point energy or something of that sort. They always talk about extracting energy from a source of energy which already exists. And the new theory puts a different light on this, a different picture. What it shows is that quantum waves arise in two kinds. There should be real waves, which are real waves of energy travelling through the fluid ether, like the compression waves in the liquid, or if you like, the sound waves in air. They're longitudinal waves. And there are also abstract waves which we won't worry about. But these real waves create excess creation in the ether itself. And these create in turn the long-range density gradients and pressure gradients in the ether, which are responsible for gravitational force. What this suggests is that if we can find a way of creating real quantum waves, We can't do it directly. We have to hope that some coupling exists with another force we can get hold of, like electromagnetism. If there's a coupling between electromagnetism and quantum waves, which I hope and there is, and then we could create quantum waves, which in turn would cause excess creation, and the result of this would be twofold. One, it ought to be possible to create waves and then extract the power electrically. This will be free energy from what is called a vacuum in common parlance. I call it energy from the ether by excess creation. And also, one could create extra gradients in the ether. Very, very tiny gradients are required, and this would produce an artificial gravity force, which could be directed upwards and therefore create levitation effects. So it should be possible, according to the theory, to create energy by this means and without having to use any fuel input.
So that's actually a positive thing. I mean, if we can just get people to accept this theory and then perhaps research this area more, then we could possibly tap into the vacuum and create extra energy.
I would think it's quite feasible. If it sounds very unlikely because you are creating energy from nothing, at present scientists will say it's impossible to create energy from nothing as if it's an accepted fact. It is an accepted fact, and it's not correct. If you like to think about this, in the ether you have a mixture of positive and negative energy, which means that if you were trying to push two objects, in fact we're going to call these objects now are the primaries. We're going to consider two primaries, one of positive energy, one of negative energy, and we'll assume they're at rest, just for the sake of argument. And then you're going to accelerate them in the same direction. Well, to accelerate the positive one, you have to push it in the direction you want it to go. To accelerate the negative one, you have to pull back on it, and then it accelerates in the other direction. So, waves can produce exactly the same way. And in fact, the waves going through the ether are very complicated because there are two sets of waves and they don't couple together. So one goes through the positive phase and one goes to the negative phase, and they travel independently of each other by means which I won't go into. Now supposing they go through they have different propagation speeds, which they do. They go faster through the negative phase than the positive. So you start off by pushing the ether, and the positive and negative wave are generated together by pushing in the same direction. But the force required to push the positive wave and create it is oppositely directed from the negative one, so the two forces cancel out. So you get a push which requires no effort whatsoever to produce it. It produces two waves, so you get two waves produced together with zero energy input to do it. A bit later on, these waves go out of phase, and instead of the pressures cancelling out, they now add up, and the particle motions, instead of being in the same direction, are now opposed. The positive phase and negative phase are actually flowing through each other in this region, and that creates excess creation. So at that point, it should be possible to put in a probe and extract some power. You put no power in to create the waves in the first place, and yet the two waves at this second point are producing finite energy.
So what we need to do is to find some way of coupling with these quantum waves and then to tap into the excess creation of energy that is found when the positive and negative energies go out of phase because of their different speeds and frequencies. If we could do that, we would seem to be able to get energy from out of nothing. If the stories of people who have built free energy devices are to be believed, then it might be this that they have done, even though they probably won't have known the theory behind it. Ron, one of the interesting things about this theory of yours is that it actually leads to an explanation for some of the psychic phenomena we witness. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, and specifically into the one which has been investigated quite a lot at the moment, which is survival after death.
Certainly. Yes, well, of course, survival after death comes out immediately as a prediction of a theory, because the mind isn't part of the brain, it's the part of the background structure, it's part of the ether. And therefore, this can have the potential to be immortal. It means that the mind couples with the brain and matter, and then when the brain dies, the mind is simply left behind, functioning just as it did before. What is also a feature of the theory is that our matter system has been deliberately contrived by a mathematical method. It's very similar to producing a three-dimensional virtual reality. Instead of it's three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional, but it seems to have been created in a similar way to those we produce on our computer screens. Just as one matter system can be generated, so could a whole range of others. They could all have somewhat different laws of physics, because these have only been contrived, so some could have different laws of physics, and then the mind could dispense with its experience from one matter system and transfer to the next. It would do this automatically in our case. The body dies, and so the mind automatically switches to another level. When I say level, I'm not talking about a level measured on the centre of the Earth or from the surface of the Earth. I'm talking about a level of frequency. Each matter system could be designed to operate at a different matter frequency, and then just as one tunes in to BBC 1 or BBC 2 by adjusting the frequency of the tuning to different electromagnetic waves, our matter systems are tuned to different quantum wave frequencies. So there'll be another matter system at a different quantum wave frequency, which the mind would then relate to. So that explains why survival can be expected as a prediction of the theory.
So when we die, our mind lives on, and the body that's left is just a system of matter that has a particular frequency, and the mind then goes to another system of matter with a different frequency.
Yes, that's right.
All controlled by this grid.
Yes. It's a different picture from the one conventional physics produces. They have an infinite number of matter systems, which is absurd, in my view. But these are only there to solve the problem of wave-particle duality. And the way they do this is to say that a whole infinite arrangement of systems has to be there, so that just one can be crystallised out by the active observation to collapse wave functions.
But in your theory, the waves are separate from the particles of matter because it's the waves that actually interact to create the matter.
That's so. The waves are creating our particles of matter. So you only need one matter system, but in fact a large number of other matter systems can be co-created, each independent of the other. There's no dependency one upon the other, indirect dependence, and it can't be an infinite number because there just isn't enough room.
How do you mean not enough room?
Well, we're not talking about different dimensions now, we're talking about different frequency levels. And we're only going to have, in this theory, allow for 3 dimensions. And so there's a finite volume, And so you couldn't, in fact, have an infinite number of matter systems because the particles of matter in each system would eventually jam up the whole available space.
How many do you think there might be?
This is something which I can't really produce a figure from any scientific method because it would be many thousands. But the theosophists, they say there are about 97.
Well, that's marvellous, explaining survival after death. In fact, we have several lives to look forward to.
Yes, I think so.
Different systems of matter. What about healing? We know that healers do actually now manage to achieve fantastic things, curing people of cancer, tumours, and like that. How does that work within the functioning of your theory?
Well, the background medium, the ether, is a structure which has properties of a neural network, and neural networks have memory and learning capacity. So, because it's so very fine-grained, I mean, there were thousands of filaments, even across the space of a tiny electron, there were thousands of them. So that we're talking about an exceedingly fine-grained structure. And of course, it's spread through the whole space, so the amount of memory capacity is absolutely, it's more than astronomical. It is an underestimate. It's unimaginably large. It means that every experience of every person alive or ever has lived in every one of these matter systems can be stored in the space available for storage of all this information. Well, because of this, the grid has memories stored away of what cells should look like, what healthy cells should look like, and what disease cells should appear as. And so, what I suggest happens is that the healer is a person with an ability to program the ether in some way by their minds, by their intention. And they program the ether to search for a match between the known properties of what healthy cells should be like and match them with the cells of the body which are faulty. And then carry out a restructuring process to make the defective cells healthy again. And a person being healed feels a heat sensation generally. This is probably an illusion. What's probably going on is restructuring of the cells, which the nerves interpret as heat. So we have a mechanism there for explaining healing. Now, it may be that there are two kinds. The healer themselves may be able to carry out the healing directly by programming the background medium directly, but more probably they will not be able to do that directly. What is more likely is that some other entity with closer to the background, with more experience, has to be relied upon to do this. And so they have to work through someone in the next domain who would do the work for them.
But both could have hearing, one could do it, or both could do it.
Both, one could do it, or both could do it. Both could do it together, possibly. And also, the person being healed can be a factor too. It is known that some people self-heal. They have a picture in their mind of say, a tumour which they know they have, and they think of it being attacked by little hammers or little pickaxes, and in certain cases they manage to cure it themselves. So in this case, these people may be able to direct to consult the ether and program it directly.
So it would appear that healers could virtually do anything with our bodies to repair them.
Yes, it does seem though to be somewhat hit and miss. The healer can sometimes produce miraculous effects on certain people, and then nothing happens when they try it on other people. And what the reason for this lack of success is, I don't know. It may be that the person being healed, for some reason, is resisting the healing process for reasons unknown to us. Also, you can get healing at a distance, and this is explained also by the theory, because everything is interconnected by the filamentous structure, and so it should be possible to program the ISIS to carry out healing at a distance, provided enough information is given to lock onto the required target.
I see. Talking about healing at a distance and transmission of information at a distance takes me on to my next question. Previously, with the conventional theory, the concept of non-locality was used to explain something like telepathy. I know your theory does away with non-locality, and also that in your theory the primaries can travel faster than the speed of light in some cases. Is this a method which explains the concept of telepathy? Perhaps you can tell us a bit more about that.
I think telepathy is carried by the filaments themselves and not through the liquid, not through the vapour state, the fluid vapour state of the ether. Because I think it's connected with non-locality. Now, non-locality is an instantaneous transmission of well, the physicists don't say information, they avoid it because if information is travelling instantaneously or even higher than the speed of light, it conflicts with Einstein's theory, which says this is impossible, and they don't want to do this. So they avoid the useless term information travelling faster than light. I think now we can dispense with this kind of thing, because nothing in the new theory prohibits anything travelling faster. Well, nothing in the present theory prohibits information travelling faster than light. Certainly light waves don't travel faster than light, but information would travel down the filaments instantly, because the filaments are the ultimate liquid or the ultimate solid, and their bulk modulus will be infinite. If you have an infinite bulk modulus, then the wave would travel instantly, so you could in fact expect telepathy to be transmitted instantaneously from one point to another. And so one would expect information travelling down the grid to be instantaneous and not taking any time at all.
Great, that seems to explain how two minds might be able to tap into the different ends of the grid to transmit the information.
Yes, it also explains why it is that only a few people can do this, because each mind has to be separated from the rest of the etheric structure by an information filter barrier, which has been deliberately programmed to cut it off from everything else, to avoid it being swamped with information, for one thing, and also for another thing, so that at any instant it's only interacting with the single matter system. If it's interacting with two together, it will be totally confused. So you have to have this information filter barrier. Once you've got it in place, you are stopping telepathy from occurring. So the only way in which telepathy could happen is if you had controlled leaks in the filter barriers of two people which matched. And then each will be able to get the message past the filter barrier, its own filter barrier, and through the filter barrier of the other person. And in this way, one could get a message from one person to the other by telepathy.
Does this explain why people are more telepathic in their sleep, perhaps, than conscious?
Yes, I would think that is so. It would mean that for some reason or other, the filter barrier could be opened up a little more at night during sleep. It would be more important at daytime too, and one is awake, to keep this shut down.
Okay, Ron, what about out-of-body experiences? Does your theory explain that?
Yes, it carries on from what we've just been saying. If the mind is part of the ether, and therefore very mobile, it can normally be centered on the brain in normal conditions. It operates through the brain, But on certain times, it is just possible that it can go out of register with the brain. Because it's out of register and could travel on its own, away from the body. Well, this would explain out-of-body experience. It could look for its new position and see its whole body, which happens. There are reports of this happening. People have out-of-body experiences generally find themselves looking down as they're at the ceiling, looking down on their bodies lying in bed. Just that the mind has gone out of register with the brain. Of course, that's moving on to near-death experiences when exactly the same thing is going to happen. The two things are really the same thing. Also, astral travelling can be explained by the same mechanism. The mind is simply travelling on its own and then feeding back the information via the grid network to the brain.
Okay, Ron, what about mind over matter? How does your theory explain that? For instance, how people manage to bend spoons?
Yes, again we can explain that by the theory. As we said earlier on, our matter system falls down to a deliberately created illusion. It's a three-dimensional virtual reality. What is surprising is that everybody can't just bend things as they want by exercising their willpower, because the mind is part of the ether and the ether is generating the matter system. What it must mean is that in order to make the world seem as real as it is, as it does, in order to make the world seem as real as it does, this is inhibited normally in most people. But certain people who have generally some peculiar experience, like being struck by lightning, and have some part of this mechanism destroyed, this inhibitory mechanism destroyed, and this then enables them to create very surprising effects. Yuri Geller's spoon bending is a typical example. He simply wills the spoon to bend, and eventually it does so and breaks. He's just restructuring the matter system by his mind.
Is this extended into objects appearing out of thin air or moving from one place to another?
Oh, yeah. Yes, again, the matter we know isn't real, it's an illusion. It's a deliberately created virtual reality. So one could imagine copying an object at a basic level of reality, copying every little item of this way of nature, copying the way its weights are produced, and then deleting that image at the place where the object resides and reading out the information at some other locality, in which case an identical copy of the object will appear.
And this would explain things like bilocation.
Yes, it would indeed, yes. The same mechanism.
Ron, thank you very much for talking to me today and for sharing your theories with everyone who's listening. I personally would like to add that I find your arguments to be extremely plausible, and in fact much more so than the ones surrounding the old Big Bang theory.
Thank you very much, Rory.
If anyone listening would like more information on the work M10 Services does, then please feel free to visit the website www.evolutionday.com. There you'll find other M10 publications and news of oncoming seminars. If you'd like them, tapes and CDs are available via the website or the above address and cost between £8 and £16. If you'd like to purchase them, please contact us. Or alternatively, if you wish to tape this current recording yourself, please go ahead. All we ask is that you consider the work that went into producing it and the work that will be invested in future interviews. If you'd like to contribute towards this and to help our cause in some small way, then please send a financial token of your appreciation to the PO Box address. Thanks very much.